right. Hi, everyone. Let's get started. So thank you so much for joining us for our ongoing 2025-2026 webinar series that we're presenting as part of the Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman Research Center. Our acronym is BEAR. It's great to have all of you with us today. Although we're meeting remotely, we do wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. My name is Sonia Kang. I am the Canada Research Chair in Identity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and a professor of organizational behavior here at the University of Toronto, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I'm really happy to welcome Dr. Erika Kirgios from Chicago booth today. Before I introduce her, I'll just give you a couple of quick points about how the webinar is going to work. So throughout the session, you can feel free to submit questions anytime using the Q&A tab on your Teams screen. Anytime during her presentation or afterwards, you can enter questions. And then at the end, I can ask her those questions for you, for as long as we have time. Okay, let me tell you a little bit more about Erika. So Erika is an assistant professor of behavioral science at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and she's a co-PI of the HOPE Lab, which stands for Honesty, Opportunity, Pro-Sociality, and Ethics. Love that. She received her PhD in Operations, Information, and Decisions from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research examines the decision-making biases that underlie inequality, and she designs interventions to improve outcomes for women and members of racial minority groups, as well as to promote pro-social behavior more broadly. She also studies the strategic choices people make when anticipating discrimination. Erika, thanks so much for being here with us today. I'm really excited for your presentation, so I'll hand it over to you now.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited to share this work with all of you. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about that latter stream of work that Sonia mentioned, looking at how diversity incentives affect women's leadership aspirations. And this is work in collaboration with Edward Chang at Harvard Business School, who is a close collaborator of mine. And Edward and I were really inspired to start this research when we saw some headlines that were not so shocking in 2021 when they appeared, but I think would be substantially more shocking today in 2026. Like this one, which talked about McDonald's new allyship through accountability program, whereby they plan to hold their executive team accountable for progress towards clearly quantified diversity goals and metrics. So they were planning to make some of the annual incentive compensation award for the C-suite members contingent on progress towards those diversity goals. And they were not the only organization to do something like this. Several other Fortune 500 companies, including American Express, Cardinal Health Inc., and several other pharmaceutical companies and electric utility companies, decided to tie some portion of executive pay to internal diversity goals. And we thought that this was an example of a pretty interesting initiative that we defined as a diversity incentive policy, where diversity incentives are essentially incentives paid out to some member or members of an organization based on how much progress they make towards measurable diversity-related outcomes. So we're talking about clearly quantifiable objective outcomes, like outcomes tied to representation, either at the entry level or at higher levels of an organization, or outcomes like mentorship hours. And even though all of these examples of diversity incentives are paid out at the executive level, you could imagine diversity incentives being paid out to middle managers as well, for example, based on the number of hours they devote to internal causes that are intended to promote diversity and inclusion. Now, when we study incentive programs, typically in behavioral economics, we're thinking about their effects on the people who are being incentivized. And often the conclusion is that incentives can be pretty effective at motivating behavior, right? So for example, if you as an organization pay people to go to the gym or pay people to get health screenings, they are more likely to subsequently go to the gym and get health screenings. But there's something really interesting about diversity incentives and unique relative to those other incentive programs, which is that it's not just the incentivized person who's in the organization, but also potentially the target of the incentivized behavior, the woman or racial minority or other marginalized group member who might be hired or promoted or mentored while the program is in place, and might, as a result, wonder, was I hired, promoted, mentored because of who I am, or was it because of this diversity incentive program? And so we became really interested in how the presence of these kinds of diversity incentives would influence the targets of the incentivized behavior, what we would call kind of the supply side of the diversity equation, the women and racial minorities that an organization is trying to hire, promote, and foster if their goal is to diversify their ranks. And in particular, we were interested in this question in the context of women's leadership aspirations. So what is the effect of implementing a diversity incentive program on the aspirations to lead of the women currently in their workforce? We were interested in this in part because there is, unfortunately, a robustly replicated, well-established gender gap in leadership aspirations, such that equally qualified women are less likely to say that they aspire to be leaders than men. This has been demonstrated across contexts, and one reason for this gender gap in leadership aspirations that's been kind of promoted by prior literature, particularly in economics, is the idea that this is simply stemming from a difference in preferences, that, women, for example, have more obligations at home outside of the office that prevent them from having the same leadership aspirations as men do, or perhaps women's self-image is incompatible with their view of what a leader looks like or what a successful leader should be. And so they simply don't see themselves in that role and they prefer not to occupy that role. And there's quite a lot of literature suggesting that that's where the gender aspiration gap comes from. And if this were the case, we would really not expect diversity incentives to have much of an impact on the gender gap in leadership aspirations at all. It shouldn't really influence women's willingness to aspire to leadership if it's simply coming from the fact that they aren't interested in leadership positions at all. But there is some evidence that that's not the only thing that's happening, that the gender gap in leadership aspirations also comes, at least in part, by concerns about your likelihood of success. That conditional on the same level of performance, the same ability, a woman and a man might form significantly different inferences about how likely they are to actually be able to attain leadership positions if they publicly state that they aspire to attain them. And that can come from both, kind of a lack of belief in your own ability. So stereotypes can be internalized and lead to biased self-assessments, such that, again, looking at, the same level of performance, the same level of ability, a woman would judge herself to actually be less qualified than a man, despite that objectively not being true. But it can also be driven by perceptions of your environment and concerns about not being supported on the pathway to leadership or facing backlash on the pathway to leadership. Because if women believe that people tend to expect that, women are meeker and softer and more compassionate and less assertive and behave in ways that are inconsistent with the prototype or stereotype of what a leader looks like, they might expect that if they do assert themselves, if they do behave ambitiously and say, I want to manage others, I want a leadership position in this firm, that they'll be met with backlash rather than being met with the kind of instrumental support that can be necessary to attain those positions. And so the question is, if you're an organization and you really want to close the gender leadership aspiration gap, what should you do? And we think it's going to be more fruitful to try to tackle those concerns about likelihood of success than differences in preferences, in part because arguably you don't want to change preferences. You want people to kind of live the life that they want to lead for themselves. But if a lack of confidence in your environment or in yourself is what's driving a reluctance to aspire to leadership, that might be something to tap and to try to tackle from an organizational perspective. And we think what an organization could do here is provide signals that women will be supported on the path to leadership in order to boost their confidence, their belief that if they aspire to leadership, they can attain it, thereby potentially increasing their willingness to state those aspirations. We think that kind of at baseline, women are in organizations trying to form expectations of their likelihood of receiving support with incomplete information. So they're looking around themselves, trying to figure out, is this the kind of environment where people genuinely support gender diversity? Is this the kind of manager who is going to take the concrete steps to sponsor me, to make sure that I have the opportunities I need, whether it's being put on high visibility projects or put into high potential programs, such that I can be on track for a leadership position? And so we think that in that kind of environment, women are probably looking for signals that they will be supported. The issue is that if you are in a male-dominated organization, particularly one that is in a context that is stereotypically perceived as masculine, like tech or engineering, credibly signaling support for gender diversity might be difficult. That's in part because your pure gender balance sends a pretty strong, inconsistent signal that, hey, if we're 70% male, that's what the prototype of a successful person looks like. So most of the people who are succeeding here are men. Most of the people who are rising through the ranks in this organization are men. And so that sends a signal about who is likely to be supported here. And it's also the case that, at least historically, and I think a little bit still today, cheap talk around these issues is all too common, where organizations will make claims that they care about or support gender diversity without actually necessarily backing that up with action. And so a woman in this kind of male-dominated firm might look around herself, see this strong signal that, men are the people who are supported here purely from the demographic makeup of the firm. They might hear, we value gender diversity, and wonder, how much am I really supposed to buy that? And if we look to the economic literature on signaling in general in conditions of uncertainty, a key driver of signal efficacy or signal credibility is cost, where cost is, the time, the effort, the money that is put in to back up a signal. In general, if you have made costly investments in signaling equality, people are more likely to believe that, you actually have that underlying quality. And that's in part because, investing money, time, and effort suggests that you genuinely care, and in part because costly signals are less costly when you actually have the underlying quality. It's a bit of a complicated sentence, so I'm going to give you an example from the literature just to make it clearer. So if you think about signaling theory, it was devised on the labor market. Often when you're applying for jobs, the quality that you're trying to signal is, I'm competent, I'm smart, I would be a good employee. And one way that people try to signal that is by acquiring credentials. So they go and they get their MBA, for example. That's a costly signal. You are paying money, you are investing time and effort and resources, both in getting into the program and then completing that degree. And so that suggests that, you genuinely are high quality, but it's also true that that is a cheaper signal to attain for somebody who has the underlying quality, for somebody who is smart and competent and effective, than for somebody who doesn't. And that's because, for example, a smart, competent, effective person might be more likely to get scholarships, which would literally financially make the MBA cheaper, but they also should have an easier time testing well, writing a good essay, and getting into the program. The program itself should be easier for them to complete. So completing an MBA should be a strong signal that you actually are competent and qualified. And the same should be true, we think, in the case of something like diversity incentives, where you're clearly investing money in signaling that you care about gender diversity, and organizations with the underlying quality should be more willing to invest in the signal. And that's because the cost benefit of analysis of investing in diversity incentives should make more sense for an organization that genuinely values gender diversity. Because if you don't value gender diversity and you implement a diversity incentive program, you might have to pay out those incentives in return for something that you don't actually value: more women in leadership positions in your workforce, or more women in your workforce in general. But if you do genuinely value gender diversity, now you're paying that incentive in return for something that you do value. And that cost benefit analysis should make more sense. So we think that from this economic signaling perspective, communicating diversity incentives may be motivating to women. They may increase women's willingness to express leadership aspirations because they serve as these literal costly signals of organizational support for women's advancement. They tie monetary stakes to goal progress, and firms that genuinely value women's advancement should be more willing to institute diversity incentives. So there should be a match between willingness to invest in diversity incentives and actually having that underlying quality of caring about women's advancement in the organization. As a result, diversity incentives should meaningfully shift women's beliefs about how likely their managers are to sponsor them and support them on the path to leadership. Now, obviously, the incentive is a firm level signal. It's not something that their individual manager is electing to implement, but we think that it will still shift their perceptions of how likely their individual manager is to support them, in part because people tend to conform to organizational norms, especially those who have risen through the ranks at the organization. And with, tendency to leave organizations that don't share your values, you can expect that somebody who's ascended to management is a better fit for the organizational values. And so if you get this strong signal that organizational leadership cares about diversity incentives, it should trickle down to your beliefs about what your manager cares about and what your manager will do. So our assertion here is that when women learn that their organization has implemented diversity incentives, it will shift their expectations of how likely they are to be supported on the path to leadership. And that should shift their expectations of how likely they are to succeed, which in turn should increase their willingness to express leadership aspirations. Now, this is a pretty positive story to this point, and some of you listening might be thinking, okay, but you're missing some of the dynamics that could be happening here. And we do think that there is reason to think that communicating diversity incentives might actually conversely be demotivating to women and reduce their willingness to state leadership aspirations. And in fact, if you look at the literature in organizational behavior and psychology, that's kind of the dominant narrative. And that's because diversity incentives might cause identity threat. They might make women worry that if they were to be selected or promoted, it would be because of their gender and not because of their underlying skills and qualifications. And that could undermine their confidence. It could increase their concerns about facing stigma, or even lead them to self-stigmatize themselves and to kind of believe that their abilities are lower than they actually are. So they might evaluate themselves worse, again, even conditional on the same level of objective qualifications. People also have the intuition that intrinsic and extrinsic motives are incompatible with each other. And so women who learn that their organization has implemented diversity incentives might say, well, you wouldn't need the incentive if people actually genuinely cared about diversity here. So the presence of this financial incentive might signal that there's a lack of intrinsic desire to pursue gender diversity at the firm, and that might demotivate women. And finally, again, they might worry about potential backlash to the incentive. If people perceive the incentive to be a preferential treatment towards women, they might worry that their manager, not having selected or opted into the incentive themselves, might become angry at the organization and take it out on them. And all of that might decrease their expectations of receiving support, and as a result, decrease their willingness to express leadership aspirations at all. So we have these kind of two compelling competing narratives, one based on a pretty rational economic signaling perspective, and one based on, what we might expect about identity threat, or people's intuitions about how intrinsic and extrinsic motives line up next to each other in the same person. And we wanted to pit these against each other to try to understand how actually do diversity incentives influence women's aspirations. To do that, we started in the field. So we worked with a large global telecommunications and engineering firm to run an experiment looking at how diversity incentives affect women's leadership aspirations. And then I'll show you some follow-up experiments that we ran online to try to understand and pick apart the dynamics we identified in the field. But I'll start with the fields because that's my favorite place to start. So we partnered with a large global telecommunications and engineering firm. They had set this kind of long-term agenda, hoping to increase the representation of women in managerial positions at this firm. The firm overall, across the board, was about 75% men and 25% women. but representation was a little lower once you got to line manager levels. So starting with like the very lowest tier management position, a line manager, which is the first position at which you're managing others in the firm, the first leadership position in the hierarchy, they only had 21% women there. And so they had set an internal goal to increase the representation of women in managerial positions from 21% to 23% by 2024. And they had set this goal at the end of 2021. And what was exciting for us is that they had also decided that a portion of executives' year-end bonuses in 2025 would be contingent on progress made towards this goal. And they had communicated none of this outside of the C-suite. So they had set this agenda within their leadership team, and they had not yet communicated this to the rest of their employee base. And what they allowed us to do was run an experiment communicating this with some employees. In particular, they let us intervene during their annual evaluation process and embed information about the goal and incentive program in an email prompting female employees in their Europe and Latin America offices to complete their self-evaluation. So every year, as part of the evaluation process, managers evaluate all of their direct reports complete self-evaluations, and then they have a long meeting where, they bring the self-evaluation and the evaluation, they talk about how the past year went, they set goals for the future year, and they talk about the employee's future at the firm. So this is, a really important moment in the organizational processes. And they allowed us to essentially intervene in the first email blast that went out to all employees, reminding them, hey, it's time for self-evaluations. In particular, our sample includes just a subset of the women at the firm. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But we were able to randomly assign employees to one of 3 experimental conditions. I'll show you the exact language on the next slide. But in the control condition, they saw no information about the internal diversity goal or the incentives tied to that goal. They were just reminded of the organization's broad diversity value statement as part of this email telling them, hey, please complete your self-evaluations. In the goals only condition, they only learn about the goal and not the incentive. And in the goals and incentives condition, they learn about both the goal and the incentive. And we wanted to run the experiment this way so that we could kind of disentangle and separate, to the extent that we're changing women's behavior in one direction or the other, what action comes from simply learning that your organization has set a measurable goal to increase diversity, and what action on top of that comes from knowing that they've tied monetary incentives to that goal. So this is what the language looked like. At the very beginning of the email, in the control condition, we say, as you're completing your annual performance evaluations and conversations, also remember that Company X believes that diverse and inclusive teams drive performance. Obviously, the company's name is not Company X, but for anonymity, that's how we'll be referring to it today. That language was in all of the emails, and it's repeated again at the very end of the email. All of the space in between is devoted to kind of logistics, sharing the link for completing self-evaluations, reminding them what they should be reflecting on from the past year. The language in blue is presented in the goals only and goals plus incentives condition, but not in the control condition. And it reads, this belief is supported by a target to increase women's representation in line manager positions from 21% in 2021 to 23% by 2024. And then in green, only in the goals and incentives condition, we also share, and executives are now incentivized to make sure we achieve this across Company X. So you can see, in every condition, you're getting a reminder of the diversity values that the organization shares on their website. In the goals only condition, you're also learning about this measurable goal, and only in the incentives condition are you learning that there is a financial stake tied to goal progress. So our sample includes 2,035 female non-manager employees from the Europe and Latin America offices of this firm. So these are all employees who do not yet have the responsibility of managing others. There are several tiers in the organization's hierarchy before you get to a management position. So some of these employees have been at the firm for a while. They've already been promoted. They simply don't have any management responsibilities. And we only were able to include women in our sample because the firm felt pretty strongly that they wanted men to see only the control message, where they learned about the organization's diversity values, but were not informed about the goal and the incentive. Women were also randomly assigned into the same condition as their manager. So we had cluster random assignment where managers were assigned to an experimental condition, and then all of their female employees were in the same condition as their manager. And that's because we knew that as part of the evaluation process, after completing their self-evaluations, they would meet with their manager to talk about their future at the firm. And we didn't want to create awkward conversations where managers and their female employees had different information about the goal and the incentive program. So again, all male employees receive the control email. Our primary dependent variable of interest is an item that is always every year on the self-evaluation form. It reads, I want to manage / continue managing others. Because all of our sample includes non-manager employees, for them, this question essentially amounts to, I want to manage others. So I want to, or I aspire to having these leadership responsibilities. And we coded the answer as 1 if the employee said yes, and 0 otherwise. And we're looking at that binary choice at whether employees are signaling to their manager, who is going to look at their self-evaluation and discuss it with them, that they want to be on the path or on the track to leadership in this firm. So what you're going to see on the y-axis are the proportion of female employees indicating that they are interested in being a manager. And on the x-axis, we have experimental condition. So in the control condition, where women simply learn about the organization's diversity values, about 43% of female employees say, I'm interested in being a manager. When they learn about the goal alone, so not about the incentive, but just the goal, this remains unchanged. And when they do learn about the incentive, what we find is that women are significantly more likely to express leadership aspirations. About 48% of them do so. And looking at our pre-registered regression, we find about an 11% regression estimated increase in women's leadership aspirations. So about 11% more women are saying, I'm interested in being a leader in the goal and incentive condition relative to either the control or the goal alone. So this improvement seems to be coming specifically from tying monetary stakes to the goal rather than from setting a measurable goal more broadly. We did look at whether there was heterogeneity in this effect. So do different women respond differently to this kind of incentive program? And we found no evidence of differential effects based on the employee's tenure. So had they been at the firm for 2 years or 8 years, their job stage, as I mentioned, there are several promotions before manager. We found that regardless of job stage, whether you were at the very first entry level or even the second or third level, all women responded similarly to the incentive program, and no evidence of moderation by team gender composition. So whether you're the only woman on your team or one of several, you're responding similarly to the presence of the incentive. We also found no effect on women's self-evaluation. So we don't find some, self-stigmatizing kind of decrease in your perceptions of your own ability or your own impact over the past year, because as part of your self-evaluation, you're asked to evaluate your impact on the firm and the quality of your work. And we found no difference across conditions in women's self-evaluated ability. We also looked at manager evaluations of their female employees, and we found no difference in the quality of women who aspire to leadership. So it's not like the diversity incentive makes less qualified women who are evaluated more harshly by their managers suddenly say, I want to be a leader too. The quality of women who are indicating leadership aspirations is similar across conditions. Now, even though men aren't randomized into a condition, what you might ask is, okay, the women on their team and their manager are still randomized into a condition. Maybe some of that information leaks through. Maybe they have a conversation about this new incentive program, and that leads men to behave differently. We found no evidence of a change in men's aspirations based on the experimental condition that their manager and their female colleagues were assigned to. So no evidence of either no evidence of leaked information or no evidence that the leaked information changed their behavior. So overall, in this field context, we find that telling women about diversity incentives increased the likelihood that they expressed a desire to lead and take on managerial responsibilities at their firm by over 11% relative to both a control condition where they simply are reminded of the firm's diversity values and relative to learning about the organization's diversity goals alone, which really suggests that this increase is driven by the incentive rather than the goal. Of course, we were interested in replicating this effect. This is just one context, so we wanted to conceptually replicate this online in an incentive-compatible experiment. And we wanted to look more closely at how men respond to diversity incentives targeted towards increasing the representation of women in a given context. So here we had 915 online participants who passed some pre-randomization attention checks just to make sure that they were really locked into the survey. They created gendered avatars and participated in 2 rounds of a number grid game adapted from a behavioral economics paradigm that is often used to study gender gaps in competitiveness or in application rates. So this is what women and men in our study saw. They are asked to describe their gender identity, and they're shown an associated avatar, so they can kind of expect that as they generate a profile for themselves, whoever views their profile will know what their gender is. And then they complete some practice rounds of this number grid game where they're selecting 2 numbers that add up to 100. They're trying to complete as many of these as possible within a 2-minute time period. In the first round of this game, they are paid piece rate. So every time they complete a number grid correctly within the time limit, they earn 10 cents. This is essentially a practice round. In round 2, they learn, okay, payment's going to work a little differently now. In this round, you're going to choose whether to apply to become a leader. If you apply to become a leader, there will be managers who are deciding between you and one other applicant for leadership. So you're going to be pitted against one other person. Managers are going to learn your round 1 score, and their pay is going to be based on your performance in round 2. So they're incentivized to pick the best candidate for leadership. If you are selected to be a leader, you're going to be paid 20 cents per correct answer rather than being paid a mere 10 cents per correct answer. And you'll be put in a special pool of workers eligible for future high-paying tasks that the research team is going to allocate. If you're not selected to be a leader, you're going to earn $0. So here we really wanted to simulate the fact that often in the real world, there are potential costs to trying to attain leadership and failing to do so, whether it's personal emotional costs or backlash, differential treatment, feeling like people look at you differently. And so it's not costless, but in expected value, you should be earning the same amount whether you apply to become a leader or not. You can also choose not to apply to be a leader. In that case, you simply earn 10 cents per correct answer as before. Before deciding whether to apply, everyone learns that typically 32% of leaders are women. This is based on typical gender competition gaps in this context and on final performance. But they're also randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions. In the control condition, we tell them, but we value gender diversity in our leadership pool and have told managers so. So this kind of mimics the control in study 1. In the diversity goal alone condition, we tell them that's why we've set a target to increase the proportion of women in our leadership pool from 32% to 47%. So now you learn that we have this concrete, measurable diversity goal, hoping to increase the gender diversity of the leadership pool for future tasks. And in the goal and incentives condition, we add, and all managers will earn a bonus if they collectively reach this target. So now you know that there are financial stakes tied to reaching this measurable diversity goal. And the question is, do participants apply to be a leader? So on the y-axis again, you can see the proportion of participants who applied for leadership. This is split amongst men and women, with women on the left and men on the right, across the 3 experimental conditions. So first, we find again that there is no impact of learning about the diversity goal alone for women, but women are significantly more likely to apply for leadership and enter this leadership competition when they learn about the incentive as well. Meanwhile, when we look at men, we find, again, no effect of the diversity goal alone, but a directional decrease in willingness to apply when they learn about the incentive. And if you just restrict your attention to the incentive condition, you find a gender gap such that women are more likely to apply for leadership than men. Interestingly, in this particular study, we don't find a baseline gender gap in leadership aspirations, though usually with this paradigm we do. So in study 2, we replicate our findings from study 1 and extend them to focus on men as well as women, finding that men are directionally but not significantly less likely to apply when they learn about gender diversity incentives. Of course, this still leaves open the question of what's happening psychologically. Why are women more likely to apply for leadership positions when they are informed that their organization has this kind of diversity incentive in place? And at the opening of this talk, I suggested that diversity incentives serve as a costly signal of managerial support. So in study 3A and 3B, that's what we wanted to assess. We wanted to assess via mediation and moderation whether we find evidence that women do indeed see diversity signals, or diversity incentives as a signal that managers are more likely to sponsor them and provide them with critical support on the path to leadership. So in study 3A, we had 578 self-identified women participate in an online experiment where we try to mimic the scenario, the field context from study 1. So we asked them to imagine that they're an employee at a large global engineering firm called Engine X. We tell them that the composition of this firm is about 25% women and 75% men. Annual evaluations are coming up. As part of the annual evaluation process, they need to decide whether to ask their manager to put them up for a promotion to become a manager themselves. In the control condition, we simply tell them, as you're completing your evaluations, remember that Engine X believes that diverse and inclusive teams drive performance. And here, since we never found a difference between the goals and incentives condition, we just have one treatment condition, the diversity incentives condition, where we add this belief is supported by our new incentive program, which provides bonuses to executives based on whether they successfully increase women's representation in manager positions across Engine X from 19% in 2021 to 24% by 2026. Our primary dependent variable of interest is women's willingness to express an interest in pursuing a promotion to manager on a 7-point Likert scale. And we also collect their expectations of receiving sponsorship from their manager with a 3-item scale that includes the items: my manager would help me attain desirable positions, my manager would use their influence in the organization for my benefit, and my manager would use their influence to support my advancement in the organization. So first, again, we find that women are significantly more likely to express leadership aspirations when they learn about the incentive than in the control condition. And we also find that when they learn about the incentive, it significantly boosts their expectations of receiving support or sponsorship from their manager. And that in turn is correlated with an increased interest in becoming a manager themselves. So we do find some evidence of mediation by expectations of managerial support. Now, in study 3B, we wanted more causal evidence of this mechanism. So we had 996 self-identified women imagine the same organizational context. Now they're assigned to one of 4 conditions in a 2x2 design. Again, the same control versus diversity incentive condition as in study 3A, but they're also randomly assigned to a high or low support condition. In the high support condition, they're told your manager has a history of supporting female employees and helping them get management positions. And in the low support condition, they're told, although your manager has supported many male employees and helped them get management positions, your manager does not have a history of providing the same support to female employees. So they have this a priori pre-existing signal of how likely their manager is to sponsor them or to be supportive. In the high support condition, they have reason to believe that their manager is supportive of gender diversity and of women's advancement. In the low support condition, they have reason to believe the opposite. And our expectation is that if diversity incentives are primarily operating by shifting expectations of manager support, that's going to be more impactful when you don't have a priori reason to think your manager will be supportive. In other words, the marginal impact of the diversity incentive should be larger in the low support conditions than the high support conditions. So again, our dependent variable of interest is how likely would you be to say you are interested in this promotion? And our prediction is that diversity incentives will have a stronger effect on leadership aspirations in the low support condition than in the high support condition. So we have the low support condition here on the left and the high support condition on the right, and willingness to express leadership aspirations on the y-axis. And what we find is that in the low historical support condition, women are significantly more likely to express leadership aspirations when they learn about diversity incentives than when they do not. And this effect is more modest in the high historical support condition. And we find a significant interaction such that the effect of diversity incentives is significantly larger when women and otherwise anticipate low support from their managers than when they anticipate already high support. So overall, what I've shown you some evidence of today is that communicating diversity incentives to women can increase their willingness to express leadership aspirations, not because it changes women's self-assessments. It doesn't magically wave a wand and make women more confident in their own abilities, but instead by changing how they expect to be treated within their organization, by changing their perception of the type of environment they're in and how their manager will respond when they express aspirations. And we also have some evidence this might be particularly effective in organizations where women otherwise have reason to anticipate low levels of support or to be skeptical that they will be sponsored on the pathway to leadership. So an organization that really wants to signal, we're changing things, we're moving away from a history where women might have been, less supported than men, towards a new future where instead women will be receiving that critical support. Diversity incentives can be a really effective way to signal that. From a theoretical perspective, we think this work really shifts consensus about the consequences of preferential selection policies or identity conscious policies that explicitly take identity into account during selection decisions, like diversity incentives. Largely, the literature and organizational behavior would predict negative effects of this kind of policy. But we think that that's failing to consider this economic signaling perspective, this kind of rational perspective on how women who really are in organizational environments where they want to have a successful future, where maybe they do want to succeed through the ranks, will respond to these kinds of signals. This also suggests that the leadership aspiration gap can't be chalked up to differences in preferences alone, that this mechanism of differences in how likely you expect to be successful or to be supported if you express your aspirations also really drives the gender gap in leadership aspirations. And more broadly, we think this suggests that women are operating often as strategic actors, making active decisions about their career, considering organizational cues, trying to read what kind of environment they're in and respond accordingly from a strategic perspective. I also think we're expanding our view to think not only about negative signals, signals about likely discrimination that might make women wary, but also positive signals, signals of support that might instead shift their behavior in a more positive direction. Practically, obviously, although we don't think this is a time when organizations are super likely to take up an initiative like this one, to the extent that organizations are still excited about diversifying their pipeline and willing to make strides to do so, diversity incentives are one potential mechanism for that, not just because they might change manager behavior, but because they might change how women behave as well. But it's really important to follow through because insincere commitments can be a lot more harmful and damaging than making no commitments to promote gender diversity at all. And more broadly, if organizations do want to signal that they support gender diversity and support women, making signals more concrete and costly can help credibility. I'm happy to chat about future directions in the Q&A. I think I'm coming up on time. One thing that's really important to look at is what's happening today. Obviously, as I've alluded to already, the environment we're in regarding diversity and support for diversity initiatives has shifted substantially, even just in the last 12 months. And so that opens a lot of questions about how women would respond to these kinds of signals today, especially given that these signals are even rarer than they were before, and how women respond to the signals that organizations are willing to convey. And we're also interested in further investigating this interplay between what happens on the demand side, how organizations behave, and how that subsequently affects how women behave. All right, I will stop here. Say thank you for listening. Thank you to my co-author, Edward Chang, and thank you to More Than Now, a behavioral science consultancy in the UK that helped connect us to our field partner. And I'm happy to take questions at this point.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Erika. So, okay, let's start with like the question that you alluded to right there at the end. You also alluded to this at the beginning, but just thinking about the change in the climate around DEI, does your work kind of point to what organizations should do to support and increase women's like both representation, leadership aspirations, leadership success in this specific climate?
I think actually one potentially optimistic way of seeing this is that the environment has changed women's perceptions of how costly it is to signal any support for diversity at all. Because now most organizations are saying absolutely nothing about diversity and about gender And so in that kind of environment where there's this increasing hostility towards DEI, making even more milquetoast statements that women would be really skeptical of in the past might receive a positive response. So in terms of, putting yourself out there, even simply saying, no, even today, we still care about gender diversity, and it's still critical for us to promote women's equality in our organization. That's a step a lot of organizations aren't willing to take, and that's something that women might be willing to take into account in a way that they wouldn't have in 2023 when everybody was making that kind of statement. Kind of conversely, I think I would be really wary of what happens when your internal signaling and your external signaling doesn't match. Because I think what I've heard anecdotally from a lot of my friends working in large corporations is that leadership will say things like, we've had to change our external messaging, but don't worry, our values remain the same. And they're, changing the names of various initiatives, but they're saying, but
Yeah.
the initiative is still there. They're changing its stated goals even, but the
Yeah.
initiative is still there. And I would just be really, really aware. I think maybe those leaders think that they're towing the line correctly and navigating a difficult tightrope. And I'm not here to say that it's not a difficult position for them to be in right now, but I don't think that that's going to be a very effective way to signal to women that they're actually supported at the firm.
Right. So what do you think they should do
Should do.
instead?
I mean, in an ideal world, take a stance regardless of what's
Right.
happening.
Sure.
Um, Now I know that that might be legally complicated for
Yeah.
various reasons. I think at the very least, like if you can't signal via, for example, an incentive program. So if you can't use money to signal that you genuinely still care about this, you can still make signals via effort and time. So continuing to have systems and programs and processes that pretty transparently show that you are trying to consider equity. So laying bare, for example, this is exactly what our hiring process looks like. This is what our promotion process looks like. We're going to be super transparent about it so that you can see that our process is taking equity into account. And here are the, programs and initiatives, even if maybe they have different names, where you can see that we're investing effort and time into trying to promote equity. I think that can still help.
Yeah. And I'm wondering too, like I like what you're saying here about, showing investment via other types of currencies. So like, the time, um, opportunities. I think those kinds of things are also really helpful, when you're considering like the outcome, right? The outcome in the
Mhm.
end is still going to be financial for the person who's going to benefit from it, but it's
Yeah,
just like one step or two steps removed from actual money. Um,
exactly.
I also wanted to ask you, so in thinking about the results that you presented today, um, what do you think it's going to take to create, like, I think, the incentive structure that exists, like, what do you think needs to change in order for it to be acceptable? Like, what is going to be the shift, do you think, where people get back on this train?
Hmm.
Like,
Oh
obviously, we're
man.
not looking for like a big shift. Like, everyone's going to all of a sudden say, like, we're back on board and, like
Yeah,
we're investing in DEI again. But are there
that would
any
be
like
magical.
small indicators that, like we can start moving back towards this kind of incentive?
I mean, some of it honestly probably is a relief of legal pressure because I think that
Okay.
there has been substantial pressure on the legal side of things. Um,
Yep.
if we assume that that goes away, so just think, even if the legal pressure were to magically disappear, I don't know that that would make organizations suddenly turn and behave the way they were behaving before, because now there's a new wariness in the air. So what do I think could change things again? I mean, this is maybe very cynical, but organizations are fundamentally responsive to their bottom line.
Yep.
And I think part of what created an investment in diversity in the past was seeing how much the broader public, their consumers, their shareholders, whatever, cared about diversity. And I think to the extent that they believe that people more broadly care and that they're being held accountable by the public, we could see a shift back from organizations. So what I'd say is, legally organizations can't say or do certain things right now, but we as the public can still say and do whatever we want, at least for
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
And so I think continuing to keep up our pressure to say, our values haven't changed just because this broader ecosystem is shifting in these ways. It's a good reminder to firms that, when those legal pressures are relieved, they still are facing a general public that cares about whether they're
Yeah.
being equitable, being fair.
Yeah. And one of the things that you said that kind of like stuck with me is that, these signals become stronger in situations where, like right now, like it's much more costly to have them.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if in any of your work or maybe in like a future work, are you looking to see like how subtle a signal can be while still being effective?
This is one thing that we're curious about right now. So we know that there's some work in marketing suggesting that there are pretty big first mover effects for pro-social
Okay.
initiatives. They haven't really looked at DEI as much, but for example, the first firm to make some kind of big sweeping commitment to going green gets way more credit than any firm that follows suit. So we
Right.
know that taking a risk, making a statement, even when it's not clear that it helps your bottom line, that is perceived positively. Now, in an environment that's as hostile to DEI as our environment is right now, I think that's a really good question. How light touch can your
Yeah.
signal be and still be perceived as taking a risk? I think
Right.
that riskiness is kind of fundamental to the perceived cost when it's a lighter signal that doesn't have a clear financial effort or time cost tied to it. So it's not like we're spending all of these hours on mentorship that we weren't before, or we've created this really new high effort initiative, or we have diversity incentives. When it's just words, I think risk is the thing that implies costliness, and so I think that's going to be the trigger. And we are interested in studying that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So one of the things that's really important in this kind of work, obviously, is measurement and understanding outcomes. So obviously, even that could be seen, like collecting that measurement could be seen as a
Yeah.
subversive act these days.
Yes.
And so do you have any advice to organizations who are still looking to kind of like collect those data, about ways to continue doing so? And like, what are the most valuable pieces of information to collect?
I think that tracking all parts of the process is really, really important. So some of that is these like kind of clear behavioral gateway outcomes,
Yep.
who's being hired, who's being promoted. That's easy to track in some sense. But most organizations are still doing like sentiment pulses and check-ins on their employees. And some of the processes that we measured in this work, for example, I think are really important to tap into. So what are your expectations of sponsorship, or what has been your experience of sponsorship at the firm? If you find gender gaps there, you should know that
Yep.
those are probably going to multiply in the downstream question of who's applying for leadership positions. And so making sure to have your pulse on, not just like feelings of inclusion, which I think sometimes firms know they should care about, but are confused about because they feel
Yep.
abstract and diffuse, but the kind of specific perceptions like how much mentorship are you getting? How much sponsorship are you getting? How much sponsorship do you expect to get if you take certain actions? Tapping into that in your kind of yearly or quarterly sentiment pulses, depending on how often companies collect this kind of HR data, I think is really, really valuable for keeping track of the processes that can have long-term impacts.
Yep. I agree. And I think it's really important as well so that, people don't feel like they're starting everything over again, right? Like there needs to be some, momentum, even if it's like low level, that continues so that it's not just like, let's start again, everything from the bottom.
Exactly. The first step is always knowing where the problem is and where the frictions
Yeah.
are so that you can target solutions appropriately. And so at the very least, please keep tracking.
Amazing. Okay, unfortunately, we are out of time, but that was really, really interesting. Thank you so much. To everyone attending, a full recording of this session is going to be available on our website under the webinars tab. Thank you all for joining us today. The next webinar is going to be on March 11th, and we'll share details soon on our website and social media channels. Thanks again and have a great rest of your day. And thank you to Erica.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
You.